Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very delighted that we can continue with a kind of China panel series. This is not the first time in Zurich, so I'm very happy, grateful that we have a new team of panelists for today. And now we start with a kind of introduction, short introduction, maybe for 2 sentences. We have now 40 minutes panel discussion followed by the Q&A session. And I just introduced myself. I'm from Invest Hong Kong, Berlin office, responsible for Switzerland. And I'm very happy to build a bridge between Europe, Switzerland, and Hong Kong, China. Thank you. Hemant.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hemant Sabherwal, and I run the European office of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So essentially 2 hats. Number 1, trying to get companies from this part of the world to list in Hong Kong. And number 2, targeting investors here to trade more Hong Kong listed products. I'm an investment banker by background, spending many years at Morgan Stanley, including 17 years in Hong Kong. IPOs I've led over the years, a number of names you'd be familiar with, a number of the Wuxi cohort, Beijing, and SK Biopharma out of Korea. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Greg. My name is Stella. I'm in charge of Tigermed in Switzerland. Tigermed is a global clinical CRO. We support biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies for all stages of clinical trials. Very happy to be here to discuss the Great China topic. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Paul Hermant, as you can see. I'm a partner at the international law firm Bird & Bird, which probably most of you have heard about because by most measures, we are the number 1 law firm, international law firms in life sciences in Europe, at least in Asia, perhaps less so in the United States. I'm a corporate and commercial partner. And by the way, I'm leading the corporate life sciences group in the firm. Heavily involved in Chinese work, in and outbound. Been doing this for about 15 years, which makes me a kind of ancestor in the meantime, and happy to be here. And by the way, I took the ambitious decision to start learning Chinese a few years ago, but shamefully, 我不会说太好.
So my name is Stephan Lensky. I'm Chief Business Officer and Chief Operating Officer of EpimAb Biotherapeutics. We're a company based in Shanghai. I've been with the company since foundation, and we are a company specialized in the generation of multi-specific antibodies based on our own platform. We are actually a company that you can derive from the Hong Kong website, Hong Kong Exchange website. We have filed for stock exchange, for listing. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I look forward to this exciting panel. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ximing. I'm a principal with Pureos Bioventures. We are a venture capital fund based in Zurich, Switzerland. So we invest in innovative companies doing drug development. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for all the introductions. So I have a kind of order. Of course, I will first address Hemant from Hong Kong Exchange. Hemant, the Hong Kong IPO market has been very active recently. What are the key trends driving this? And how does biotech fit into this equation? And can you elaborate a bit on the specific biotech listing chapter? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. It's great to sit here today because I'm able to deliver a message that frankly is not one that has consistently been there over the last 10 years or so, and that is that in 2025, Hong Kong ended the year as the number 1 IPO venue globally, raising $37.5 billion across the market. That has continued in the 2 months so far of this year. We've done another 10.5 billion of IPO volume, and again maintain our number 1 position at the moment. From a healthcare and biotech perspective, that has obviously been a large part of our market. A large part of our issuance volumes have been driven by new economy sectors. So last year we had about 4.5 billion of healthcare IPO volume, and about 2 billion of that being biotech specific. Historically, obviously, NASDAQ has been the number 1 exchange when it comes to the biotech sector globally, but we are the consistent number 2, and that was again replicated during the course of last year. If I look at secondary markets, which is obviously important because it's not just about getting a company listed, it's about that aftermarket performance. Our overall Hang Seng index was up about 28% last year, but biotech was our number one sector, up 65% over the course of 2025, and up a further 10% so far this year. So things are very much working from a sector perspective. And then I just add, in terms of the pipeline going forward, as Stephan said, he's one of our cohort, but we actually have 400 companies in our public A1 filing pipeline, which is a very large number historically. Of those 400, about 25% are healthcare, around half of which are biotech. So biotech for this year making up about 10% overall of our IPO pipeline. Last point I'd make, which Greg alluded to, is we have a specific chapter focused on biotech in our market. So this was started in 2018 and was meant to target earlier stage biotech companies which didn't necessarily fulfill our regular listing requirements. So in order to qualify for this chapter, there are essentially three broad parameters. Number one, you need to be past the concept stage, meaning that you have to have completed phase 1 and there's no obstruction towards commencing with phase 2. Secondly, you need to be regulated by a competent authority, whether that's the FDA or EMEA or any other equivalent. And then number 3, there needs to be a sophisticated investor on the cap table. And that's obviously a bit of a subjective interpretation, but essentially any VC would fulfill that qualification. So since we started this chapter in 2018, we've had 85 companies list under this chapter, of which 15 have what we call graduated, i.e. they have become fully commercialized, successful operations that are now fully fledged companies listed on our market. In terms of just how that trajectory has played out, when we first started this chapter in 2018 up until 2021, we had a huge number of IPOs. The market then essentially shut throughout 22, 23, and 24, and then reopened with a bang around this time a year ago.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to address Stella. Over the past decade, China's outbound licensing transactions have experienced explosive growth. As the leading and one of the earliest heroes in China, what role has Tigermed played in achieving this? Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. You're right. It's exploding. So just on the first day of the SAX Forum, yesterday there are another 2 deals announced. One is antigen with UCB, and it is CD19, CD3 bispecific T-cell engager for autoimmune diseases. And the other one, the total is $1.1 billion, the total. But one of the colleagues told me I should talk about upfront payment. But anyway, that's details. The other one is China Bio with Sanofi for another nearly marketed compound. So it is just in one day. So it's 2 big announcements. So it is exploding. So back to your question, what Tigermed has played in this booming market, I want to talk about this in 2 aspects. One is Tigermed's investment activities. So many of you audience maybe know we are a clinical CRO, but maybe you don't know that we have an investment arm. We have platforms like direct investment, like Tai Long, or through our LP participation in multiple funds. So this has formed a very strong early stage investment syndicate. So we continuously support innovation for lots of early stage projects in China. And this investment has played a very important role for the rapid growth of China biotech industry over the past years. So that's the first arm. And the second arm I want to talk about, the other key fact is the strong R&D capabilities of us. So we can provide full. I don't want to sound promotionally, but that's the fact. Okay, so we can provide full service stop for across the entire life science value chain, from preclinical to clinical stage and post-market and real study. And these are, we played these roles not only in China market, but over the past decades, we expanding to a major market like in Europe, in US, Australia, etc. So we can support the biotech companies for their global expanding, which also partially resulted for the booming of the transactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So we are very thankful to you. And now I want to address Paul. How do factors like market dynamics, talent, ecosystem, regulatory framework, or innovation infrastructure in China create strategic value compared to other global markets? What can be improved?
Just in case you didn't notice, that's the full question for all the panelists, not only for me, and I'm probably not even the best place to answer all of them, so I'll be quite short on everything else but the legal, regulatory, transactional side. You've already heard, by the way, very factual information from Helen Chen just before this panel, which shows the unavoidably evident truth that China has become a big player in many more senses than if I had been on this panel 10 years ago. Market dynamics are obvious. China is already the second biggest market for life sciences in the world. It's a growing one. It's an aging one. It's a wealthier one. And something even more important, probably in the short term, with a very demanding population in terms of healthcare. So that's a guaranteed success for whatever you have in mind doing in China. For the talent ecosystems, I'll be very short as well. I'm sure that other panelists can jump in to provide their input on that. China is also involved on that topic. By some measures, probably even overgraduated population nowadays, not all of them finding jobs at the level they've studied for. Still probably lacking here and there a good knowledge of foreign markets, regulatory landscapes outside of China, certain skills. But then you have the famous sea turtles, which are certainly more than compensating for that. So let me focus perhaps on a few items on the regulatory and transactional side. Probably going from the good to the less good, and just picking a few examples. Quite a few strong evolutions recently on the regulatory side with the NMPA, which has gone through very profound reforms over the last few years. And I'll just pick up one which has a big effect, which is a much better acceptance of foreign clinical trials data. And that has changed things quite a lot and has created additional interest on what you can do in and with China. But also better approval mechanisms for series of life or life-threatening conditions, separating of manufacturing licenses and market authorizations, which has created some additional flexibility in deal-making in China. That's for the pure regulatory aspect. To come to your point about the innovation, you've heard it already from Helen, you've heard it and you're going to hear it again. China has now become a truly innovative producer of life sciences solution. It's far away from the pure copycat phenomenon of a few years ago, not more than a few years ago, with a strong emphasis, perhaps not as much as 2 or 3 years ago, because in the meantime, something like AI has happened, chips have become more important, and some of the money has been redirected into the wrong directions as compared to life sciences, but still quite an emphasis with huge resources. You probably all have heard about those investment funds, including provincial investment funds, even competing with each other to try and fund life sciences initiatives. Still a favorable tax environment with lower corporate taxation rates, with heavy incentive for R&D, with sometimes full deductions for R&D expenses, and less so perhaps than a few years ago, but still powerful if you want to maximize the tax savings. Some free trade zones still offering quite significant additional incentives. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, which I needed to do 5-10 years ago, on IP protection, unavoidably because China has become an innovative source of innovation. The patent protection has improved a lot because now China has its own interest in protecting patents. So the histories of 5, 10, 15 years ago where patents were still neglected, copied, and so on, this has almost totally disappeared. And interestingly, also in the direction of new IP rights. Data exclusivity has improved in China. The protection of trade secrets, not yet optimal, but nothing is optimal. Think about the difficulty to enforce non-compete clauses in the US, while you have the same problem in enforcing IP protection clauses in China because of the high mobility of manpower in China and the difficulty to enforce those protections when they change jobs. Moving to perhaps less positive and potential areas of development, pricing and reimbursement. Well, actually, last year, I would have mentioned this as a truly unique Chinese problem, but you've all heard about Trump and what he's done to that as well in the United States. So it's not a unique phenomenon. What has happened to Pfizer is what's happening to other big pharma companies in China now for the last 3-4 years. So you have to negotiate the price. But on the other hand, it's volume-based, and the Chinese market is hugely big. So most pharma companies have come to the conclusion that it's worth lowering the prices to have access to an enormous market. Well, I think I can stop here and, of course, answer additional questions and jump in if you wish.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now I would like to address Stephan. What are the trends around licensing to or from China? What are Chinese companies looking for from Western farmers? Can you tell some examples outbound from China deals and success, which disease areas are in high demand today? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we heard a lot in the previous talk from Helen about the enormous amount now of deal making that's been done in China with ex-China companies. This is something that started, I would say, with the J&J legend, and that was several years ago, and then also the Merck Kelun deals. Those were the first ones that were kind of starting this trend. And then in the last 2 years, we saw a lot of deals that were based on validated assets where the validation was like way into phase 2. You had deals with several hundred patients in their oncology. Look at the OncoImmune deal or even Kelun deals. There were a lot of patients that were treated already. And then when pharma was seeing those deals, they started to trust what was going on in China. There was always a kind of a mistrust in the beginning. And this trust barrier has been overcome, especially in the clinical side. As a biotech, what you're hoping also to eventually do preclinical deals. That was very, very rare in the beginning. And we're seeing more and more of those coming up. Actually, we ourselves did 2 preclinical deals last year. One we published with the Column Group, where we had a TCE asset that we out-licensed to the Column Group in a large deal. And now, yesterday, we heard this other one with UCB, which is also a preclinical deal, IND-ready asset. But in this case, also, you can see that there's a growing trust with companies in what you see in terms of preclinical data from Chinese companies. If you ask me what the trends are, I think the trend is you're going to see even more going earlier. We got signals of that with AstraZeneca and Harbor. Pfizer and Harbor also doing early technology deals, using actually China research as a kind of a hub, as their research site. Lilly and Innovent also announced such a deal. So it's getting earlier and earlier, and that basically means that the China R&D value chain, the entire China R&D value chain is practically there. It's practically to be viewed in parallel as a direct competitor to Europe and the US. And then the factor comes in that we heard at the last panel from I think it was Dan from AstraZeneca was saying, well, if you got like 10 companies from China on a list for an asset that you're looking for, and 3 from Europe and the US, the probability is 10 to 3 that you're going to take that one of those assets, because the quality at the end of the day will be very similar. It might even be in some cases better. You might have the right differentiation you're looking for in the data set of the Chinese company, and then that will do the deal. So this is something where this is the trend that I'm seeing coming up. We're seeing earlier and earlier deals, and we also talk, when I talk a lot to various pharma companies on these issues. What are they looking for? They're looking also now for more earlier assets, and not only this, well, come back when you're finished with your phase 2. That sentence I'm hearing lesser and lesser, and therefore you see the trend is, yeah, your technology, your science is actually, for me, it's early on. I see there's a proof there already. There's a validation coming up in that direction. And that is definitely a trend that is, I'm seeing more and more in China.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Now I would like to address Ximing. Why is China of interest to Western biopharmas, health companies, and investors from where you sit? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think first of all, you'll see a new wave of innovations coming out of China. So these are not only best in class programs with clinical data, but you see more and more first in class platform technologies coming out of China, and then this we all know. Then what are the fundamentals? I mean, as a VC, you really, if you evaluate different geographies, probably you need to look at the amount of money they spend in basic research. And if you do that statistics, you realize that China is actually on par with the entire European Union, Europe combined. So there must be something coming out of China that is innovative, that has potential to become best-in-class programs in the pharmaceutical industry. So that's one point. And then the second point, I would say, look at the number and quality, so quantity and quality of the graduates in life sciences. And if you look at the statistics, you also realize that China produces, simply because of its sheer, its large population, produces many more STEM graduates, including biology, medicine, than, for example, Europe. So that's another advantage. And then I think for VCs building up biotech companies, now one big topic is capital efficiency and speed of execution. So time is money. So I think there China also has some advantages, and we can later discuss this a little bit further. And then I guess lastly, for running clinical trials, China has a huge population, and many patients tend to go to large medical centers. So you basically have throughput at those large medical centers. So you kind of have many MD Andersons in China, right? People go to MD Anderson for onco treatments. That's why you can recruit patients easily at MD Anderson. And the case is similar with China, because there are a few centers and patients tend to go there. So these are the 3 points I would say why it's interesting. China is interesting for biopharma. Yeah.
May I comment on MD Anderson? So I remember I had this chief medical officer who was telling me that, well, let's work with MD Anderson, but just be clear, out of each of those sites, you might get 2 patients a year. If you get talk with those MD Andersons in China, it's going to be at least 20. So that's also a difference. Like, these sites, they deliver patients a lot more efficiently, and they're high quality patients.
Because I guess the care system is more based on large medical centers. So if you're sick or if you have some severe disease, you tend to go to large cities and go to those large medical centers. So these clinicians, they have throughput, and if you work together with them, there's also an economy of scale actually in Chinese in the Chinese healthcare system. So the quality is not bad, like in terms of instruments, in terms of knowledge, because in medicine a lot is empirical, right? Knowledge, right? So that's why it's interesting to run clinical trials nowadays in China. I would say the approval process is not that fast. It's comparable to the US. It's slower than, for example, Australia. Australia is really the to-go market if you want to run trials in oncology, for example. In Europe, I would say it's rather Spain. But if you want to find some like rare patients, you should go to China. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Stella, you have a comment to Ximing?
I think I totally agree with it. And I think the regulatory reform, I want to address this because actually can I directly go to the regulatory reform and the two major policy that just announced. The first one was the 30-day approval IND, which is important because most of you may know that since China joined the ICH, we have this 60-day approval IND. That's why Ximing said it's a little bit slower than Australia and other regulatory authorities. But in last September, China announced this 30-day IND or CTA approval process, which is significant because your innovative drug to enter China is much faster. And then plus the large patient pool, you can quickly go through your clinical trial processes. So I just want to talk a little bit details of this. It's not applied to everything. So you need to fall into 3 criteria. If you fall in either one of the criteria, you are eligible for the 30 days. So first of all, you need to, it's an innovative drugs. And then if you fall in pediatric drugs or innovative drugs for rare disease, this also count. And then the important thing is that the Global Synchronized Development, or MRCT project. So MRCT stands for Multi-Regional Clinical Trials. What does it mean? That means you need to enter China and integrate it into the whole clinical development process earlier. Then you can fall into this. Well, there's some conditions. So if you get the resource and get the approval for the 30 days IND approval, you need to start your clinical trials within 12 weeks. This is the condition. So because you can't say, okay, let me get to the 30 days and I just wait. I don't want to do it. So that's the one. So, and the other thing I want to comment is, since this new regulation, Tigermed already helped biotech and pharma companies for more than 10 cases to quickly get their IND. So it's just from September last year until now in this 5 months. Think about Christmas holiday and Chinese New Year's holiday. You take away these days. We work day and night, and together with the other thing I want to highlight is this 30-day policy is not like you only need to work with regulatory and that's it. No, this need to be a teamwork. You need to work with ethical committee. You need to even work with PI prior to the submission, and then the whole team work together and you can get this. So this is one policy. The other policy, which is very important, which related to Paul just mentioned, it's not IP protection, but it's marketing exclusivity and the data protection. So for pediatric drugs, you get 2 years, up to 2 years marketing exclusivity. So which means if CD and China FDA and NPA approved your drug in China, you have, for pediatrics, you have 2 years. Nobody can do the same one. And then for orphan drugs, you have up to 7 years exclusivity, market exclusivity. So that's really to protect these difficult areas that the sponsors put a lot of efforts and resources into, and we wanted to, the authorities want to make it a fair market, so you're protected. And then the second one we want to talk about is the data protection. So these are all new regulation. This will be implemented this May. So the new China Drug Administrative Regulations law. So you have 6 years, up to 6 years data protection, which is important for biotech companies and pharma companies. Again, I think back to the topic is that how to utilize these 6 years. You know, you need to enter the China, join the China global clinical development early enough so that you don't lose any time. And because, for example, if you started trial in the US, sorry about this, if the product is launched in the US, so in 2023, and then you enter China market, you approved in 2026, you already lose 3 years. You see, that's the way to calculate. But I'm not talking about more details, but after that, we are happy to discuss more details. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just have an extra question to you. You went IPO in Hong Kong. Can you tell me the reason? Because we have Hemant here. You, Stella? In 2020, we entered launched in Hong Kong market. I think it's a significant step for Tigermed to enter the global market. That's so important because when Tigermed was established in 2004, at that time, I think the founder once told us that I just want to do small business. I just want to do something in China market. But then we see the trend, we see the booming. So we would like to enter the global markets and support the global biotech and the pharma companies, including European companies. That's why we launched in 2020 in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange market. We also set the regional headquarters there in order to enhance our capabilities in the region. Yeah, and so far we're doing fine, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hemant, can you comment a bit on the investor base from Hong Kong biotech IPOs? Institutional type, geographical base, sophistication on biotech, etc.?
Sure. So when it comes to a Hong Kong IPO in the biotech space, there are effectively 4 broad pools of investors you target. So one is the global mutual funds, so the likes of a Fidelity or a BlackRock. Then you have Asian headquartered funds, which could be, for example, the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Funds. You then have a number of offshore Chinese asset management companies who are based in Hong Kong, have those funds to deploy on Hong Kong IPOs. And the last bucket, which is important in Hong Kong and is less important here in Europe, is the retail investor, which can be potentially between 10 and 50% of any IPO deal size. And the reason I say that's important is while the quality of these investors may not be the most sophisticated, where they really add value is from a liquidity perspective, which, as many of you will know from the markets here in Europe, one of the big issues, assuming you can get listed as a biotech here in Europe, is that it's one thing to be listed, it's another thing to have your stock trade off in sufficient volume, whereby big institutions can actually go out and buy your stock in real size. What I'd say has really developed over the last couple of years is the healthcare-specific dedicated funds. So what you've had happen now over the last year or two is a number of Hong Kong-based healthcare funds have really proliferated and really started dedicating capital. So, you know, the likes of a Lake Blue, for example, or TrueMed. But then in addition to that, a number of the historical US funds dedicated to the space have opened up regional headquarters in Asia to look at the Asian market. So again, the likes of a OrbiMed or a Vivo Capital. So people like this you're seeing very consistently on the register when it comes to IPOs. The last point I'd make from an investor standpoint is less at the IPO stage, but actually in the subsequent months afterwards. In Hong Kong, we have this concept called Stock Connect, which is basically a closed loop system between the Hong Kong exchange and two of the mainland exchanges, Shenzhen and Shanghai. And why this is important is that in China mainland, you have strict capital controls. So an institutional or retail investor in China is very restricted in terms of what they are able to purchase outside of the mainland. 10 years ago, this closed loop was set up, which basically allows onshore Chinese money to invest in 95% of Hong Kong listed companies. And what's particularly important from the biotech perspective is when we started this chapter in 2018, this chapter was not part of this Stock Connect arrangement. Subsequently, in 2021, this chapter became eligible. So now I mentioned earlier, there are 85 companies listed under this 18A biotech chapter. Over half of them are now eligible for Stock Connect, which means that for those companies that are eligible, around 20% of their free float is held by onshore China through this Stock Connect mechanism.
Thank you so much. I just want to add on, are there recent examples of international healthcare biotech companies listing in Hong Kong?
Yeah, so there were two examples I'd like to mention from last year who took advantage of our listing chapter. So one is a Singapore-based company called Morexus. These guys are an RNA diagnostics company focused on non-invasive molecular cancer screening. So these guys listed in May of last year, very successful, up 90%, 90% over the course of last year. The other name I'd mention is a bit more of a seasoned company called In Silico Medicine. So this is a US headquartered company, 90% of its revenue coming from the US. So these guys listed in December, and already the stock is up over 200%. And we have this concept in Hong Kong of cornerstone, whereby an investor, especially where it's someone strategic, can choose to be disclosed on the front cover of the prospectus in return for a guaranteed allocation. So in the case of In Silico, the names you had as part of that cornerstone were some very, very high profile institutional investors, sovereign wealth fund investors. So you've had the likes of Lilly was there, Tencent was there as two strategic examples. So the way I'd kind of think about it from a European biotech perspective is that obviously you will have your home market. The problem you will have with the home market, in addition to the liquidity issue I mentioned earlier, is that there's very little precedent. So from an investor standpoint, ideally you want the investor to really understand where you're going with the company, what you ultimately want to be as a commercialized company. And if there are precedent examples of that, that makes that education process much easier. So in the European exchanges, there's really a lack of that precedent. Hence, a lot of companies in Europe will look west towards the US, as they have always historically done. So what I would advocate for is, if you are one of those companies looking west, also consider looking east. And really what would be additionally helpful is if there is some form of a China nexus. So that could be something like, we talked about clinical trials being conducted in China. It could be production facilities. It could be, hopefully, when you become successful commercially, a Chinese client base and end market, or it could be something as straightforward as having a meaningful Chinese investor on the cap table ahead of IPO. But all these kind of factors would really help the Asian investor base with their education, with their rationale, and where the company may well fit in their portfolios.
Thank you very much. We made it just a perfect landing, because now we have the famous, the last 10 minutes, the famous Q&A session. So I would like to address the audience. Do you have specific questions? Professor Minyu Dong, do you have a question? Or this gentleman in the third row?
Perhaps one question to Hemant. You partially already answered it, but I'll ask it once again. What is the investor base before the IPO? What is the emergence of VC companies in China that are actually out of China rather than out of the United States or elsewhere?
Yeah, so, and others will have a view here as well. It's certainly one that is growing. And again, where I sit, focusing on the public markets, the area that has grown almost exponentially is really that kind of crossover type investor, that crossover round. So the guys who come in call it Series B, Series D, C, Series D, with a view to building, doing the work, building a foothold in the company as a private company, and then continuing to support the company as a public company. That's where you've seen a huge amount of growth from an onshore China perspective in terms of capital dedicated to the space. I don't know, others if...
Maybe I can add some comments. So I think there is a list of very sophisticated biotech VC investors based in mainland China. So they have done in the past a series of very, very successful companies. And many of those people have studied in the US, have worked in the US, have came back to China, built their own companies, made money, and now they're running their funds. So they tend to know China pretty well because China is a large market. It has its specifics, and they also know the world very well because the largest market in the pharma industry is the US, right? And you cannot only develop drugs only for China. It doesn't, would not pay, right? So I do think there is a growing number of good, sophisticated VC investors based in China. Yeah.
Minue? Oh, sorry. Then
no problem. Thank you for a very good discussion about the China market. If I understand right, when big pharma, Western big pharma acquire or in-license innovation from China, there may be some situation where the Chinese company keep the rights for China. So my question is, if a European company want to do studies in China to accelerate, you can either do it directly with CRO and hospitals, but is it also a possibility to do a collaboration with a Chinese company that get the rights, right of first refusal in China, to also share the cost and risks? And the main question is, will big pharma accept that if you then later want to have a global license from your company to the rest of the world?
Stephan, can you address this?
That's a very hypothetical question, if that deal is possible. It's a very interesting proposal. I can't say we have ever been approached with a direct proposal of this type. I think, at the end of the day, every biotech company as such has to have a portfolio that follows a certain strategy. So I wouldn't say you could approach any biotech and they would say, oh, let's just make some deal here. You would have to look at it as an angle as any other biotech. And the Chinese rights here will play a major role, especially in the Hong Kong exchange listing question, because if you're a stock listed company there, it might become something like a core product, although it's not originated from your end. So it's going to be not called a core product, but it will still be a key product, which will mean that you have to take care of certain rights, whatever you do with it. That said, you were talking about acquisition of a company. That's a point that is actually a little different from the SEC. The acquisition of a company that's stock listed in the US or in Europe is a straightforward and very common thing. In Hong Kong, it's not that simple. Squeeze out majorities. You have to think about the retail investors. They also have, the rules are also very protective around them. Squeezing them out is not that simple. So that makes a big difference in terms of deal making in Hong Kong. When you're a Hong Kong stock listed company, deal making has a much larger impact on the stock price, because the deal that you're making is not for an exit. It's for long-term validation. It's for long-term growth. And what does it do to the rest of your portfolio? Just to give you an example, the UCB deal that was just announced for Antengene. Antengene stock went 10% up. It's a preclinical deal. 10% up stock. I don't think you would see anything like that in the SEC. This is the thing that Hong Kong investors have a slightly different view on that, because they can't count on a full-blown exit in a classical manner. Some companies have done some, kind of unusual constructs, like the OncoImmune deal, where they basically try to spin out the asset and then sell that spin-off shell. But that's not ideal. I mean, the classical one is you just Genmab acquires Merus or something like that. That is not so easy in Hong Kong. Okay, so also for everyone who wants to go to Hong Kong, it's not the classical exit market. But it is a sustainable and very, it's got much higher liquidity than it used to have, and that's what makes it so also attractive, and the investor base is very different. What I'm seeing very often is from U.S. investors that talk to me, that they start creating Asian funds so that they can go to Hong Kong, because they like this fact that single deal making, BD, has such a positive impact on valuation of stock. So all these questions around deal making, that's very, very important in the Hong Kong stock market, far more than it is in other stock markets.
Maybe I can add to the points of Stephan. You were asking, if you want to run a trial, should you find a Chinese partner or should you do it by yourself? I think in reality, it's very hard in Europe to find a good CMO that can do China as well. That can do Europe, US, Australia, and China. So good CMOs are rare species anyhow, but like CMOs that are European and can do China, wow. You let me know, right, when you find someone. And so you want to run trials in China, what can you do? You either go to a CRO like Tigermed, or you find a Chinese partner. And those partners tend to get way better deals in China because they are in China, right? They know the conditions than you, right? So I think there's some merit in having a clear and clean cut, right? It's pretty, if you find a partner, it's pretty clear, they're responsible for China, then you don't have to care so much. You basically gain access to the data, and those data might drive up your value, right? So I think that's a little bit more feasible. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we just have 1 minute left, and I think Minui wants to make a comment or question.
Thanks a lot. Actually, I learned a lot how to chair the China Roundtable in 2 months in Basel. We have the Swiss Biotech Day, and we also have a great China, I think, booth there. So first, thanks all the panelists. Just 1 minute, I have a question for Hemant. So you mentioned actually this famous chapter 18A. It became very, successful and gets the peak year in 2021. But over past years, we also noticed actually big, decline in terms of this IPO in Hong Kong for this chapter 18. In particular, some of the company actually got lower price than after IPO. So how actually the market actually react to this type of situation, and what's actual strategy solutions to attract really the new IPOs in Hong Kong?
Yeah, so it's a fair point, and as I mentioned earlier, the listing chapter effectively dried up between 2022 and early 2025. So there were very few deals happening there, and you did see the market overall correct quite a bit, with biotech very much at the forefront of that. I think part of that was somewhat geopolitical related in the sense that you had a number of US-based investors, some healthcare specific, some more generalist, who in 2022, if you look at overall kind of China as a percent of global portfolios, it was at an all-time low historically. What we've seen since then, and certainly from a Hong Kong perspective, the uptick started in late 24 and going into 2025, is that while that China portfolio percentage is nowhere near 2021 highs, it's certainly well above the lows that were at that point in time. The other point I'd make is some of this is somewhat self-fulfilling in that really Hong Kong has become a bit of a hub from a growth perspective. And I mentioned this earlier, it's not just biotech, it's AI, it's robotics, it's deep tech, it's new energy. And as investors look for that growth, biotech is very much a forefront of that. And if you see the deals that have successfully listed from second quarter last year onwards, and what's really driven our global leading volume, it is investors seeking that growth, becoming much more educated around these growth subsectors. And I made the point earlier about having precedent deals, and that's really a key part of this, because when you have not just an investor base, obviously that's key, having an investor base who understands what you're trying to do from a drug development perspective, but having lawyers who are able to craft your documentation, having bankers who are able to help you market that story, having that ecosystem around the product is just as important. And I think from that perspective, we've been somewhat self-fulfilling, and that's what's really led to this huge IPO pipeline we have, which, and you also asked about secondary market performance. A lot of that was addressed over the course of last year, with biotech having had a couple of tough years, being the best performing sector in the secondary market. And we're seeing that to continue. So I'm hopeful, just with all this confluence of factors working together, we'll continue to see the sector develop in our market.
Thank you very much. This is now the end of the session. And if you have further questions or comments, please address the panelists during the coffee break. And I would like also to introduce my colleague at our Hong Kong table in the room, to my colleague Erica Cheong from TDC. So welcome. Thank you so much for today. Thank you very much.